so this PowerPoint we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. We can kind of talk about what it is and why it happened in Britain first, then kind of spread throughout the world, and then we're going to talk about some consequences. First time in history, we're going to get a real idea of the middle class, working class, and upper class. Because of the Industrial Revolution, these ideas will come to the forefront. And on your left is the Van Gogh Starry Night. I'm sure Van Gogh and Starry Night. This is an impressionist painting done at the time during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And then on your right, you can see this is just a generic painting, but this is something that, and we'll talk a little bit about authors and things like that, but Coketown, a lot of stuff that Dickens writes is about this pollution that the world had never seen before. It kind of comes to the forefront during the Industrial Revolution, and with it a lot of social consequences. And we'll be discussing all of those. Alright, so what the Industrial Revolution encompassed, or what it was this idea that this proliferation of large-scale manufacturing, things like textiles, capital-intensive enterprises, plantations, it was a proliferation or an enlargement of ways to organize human labor, factories, and what brings factories, what comes with factories is the idea of urbanization, right? Cities start to become large, population growth becomes astronomical because they found new ways of agriculture, new ways to find energy, power, transportation. There was a higher productivity of human resources, and then with all of this emerges consumer markets, so to speak. And the real main catalyst for all of this was energy, because for thousands and thousands of years, human beings had relied on wind, water, and wood and animals to create power and to move things. And over the course of 100 years, they went from that to coal and steam engines, right? So they went from using natural resources and animals and their own human labor to move and to get things done. And within 100 years, human beings basically had machines that could do almost anything that a human really needed to do. An example is in Great Britain in 1800, they produced about 10 million tons of coal and other fossil fuels, and by 1900 it was over 1 billion tons. All right, so it's just this massive amount of movement and of using natural resources and machines. This is also the time when the word industry changes the actual idea of what it is. Industry used to mean that a person was industrious, right? That they would do things, that they worked hard, that they created their own living. But by the mid 18th century, 1750, 1760, industry actually meant an economic system that really no one could control. Okay, so the word industry becomes what we would think of as industry today, and it was so fast and so advanced that people couldn't really stop what was happening. So why did it occur in Great Britain first? The main reason is because of what we talked about, and it had a stable government, right? After the Glorious Revolution, which was only in 1690, we're talking about the mid-18th century now, 50, 60 years later, the government was stable, and with stability and peace comes economic prosperity. Also, the government gave money for advancing science. It created a well-developed infrastructure, roads, maps, canals, bridges, things like that, things that create transportation that make it easier to get goods from one place to another. And they started really, really mining coal by the mid 18th century. What also happened as a catalyst to this is the enclosure system. I don't know if any of you have heard of this or not. The idea is it's kind of hard without a map, but really what it was is before the enclosure system, people would live in a small area and they would have a piece of land that was commonly held. It was kind of like communal living. We'll talk more about Marx next week, but it's kind of this idea that a whole bunch of farmers lived in an area and they kind of farmed the land together. Okay, and so it created this kind of communal place where, okay, we're going to grow corn here, we're going to grow beets here, we're going to grow, onions here, cabbage, potatoes, on, and it was all community held, right? Now, what the government did is they took away these publicly owned areas and they put them into private hands. So, and they usually put fences around them. Dickens writes about this. Other people write about things like this. And so what this did is the government sold these pieces of land to private companies and to private farmers who were rich enough to buy them, and things became very sophisticated and efficient after that. Instead of 10 people owning a piece of land, one person owned a piece of land, and they could do what they wanted to it, and it became a little more efficient. Now the problem with that is everybody who commonly owned the land before that didn't have any land anymore, so they had nowhere to go and nothing to farm. So what ended up happening is when they started moving into the city, and you get this whole movement of urbanization of people from the rural areas in Britain who had no more land, so they were forced to move into the city. And where did they work? They started working in factories. Okay, so that's kind of one. Not only were enclosures more efficient, but it also moved a mass amount of the population from the rural areas into the cities, and then also what this did is that London became the center of the trade in the world because of such a large navy, right? So everybody's moving into London, and we've already talked about the British Navy a little bit. The British owned the world seas by this time, so London kind of becomes what New York is today, and it will be what New York is today until after World War I, which then New York becomes what London is. It was also this idea of, I don't know if we've talked about this or not, but the Protestant work ethic, right? Britain becomes Protestant, and the work ethic is working hard to make your money was something that you wanted to do. And then when we talked about capitalism, once you made that money, then you could do what you want with it. You could put it under your bed, you could reinvest it, you could put it in the bank, you could do what you want with it, but the point is that you worked for it. Okay, and the thing about British aristocrats from other aristocrats meaning landed gentry, people who were born with money and land, is that in Britain they respected anyone who could make money, and it was also easy to become an aristocrat in Britain if you made money. We'll talk a little bit about the French Revolution next, and that was not the case in Europe, but in Britain you could buy your way into an aristocracy and into a landowning part of you could be high society. You could be hanging out with the Kardashians or something, I don't know, something like that. You could buy your way into that. Like we talked about, they kind of already they ruled the open seas as well, so you have all of these circumstances together that are creating this society that becomes very efficient and becomes based on consumer goods. There's no tariffs or tolls, so goods are moving freely throughout the country, and they're not on the continent, so they're staying away from a lot of the wars and other things that were happening in Europe at the time, right? They're kind of staying out of it, except for the Revolutionary War, which they will lose, but the real losers out of that whole war, and we'll talk about are the French, even though they helped the colonialists win the war. Um, so so what Great Britain really was doing, and we talked a little bit about this with the slave trade, is they were creating this triangular trade where they would get slaves from Africa, move those slaves to America, get goods from America like molasses, tobacco, cotton, other things, other raw materials, get those back to Britain into factories, these workshops, things like that. And then they would create all of these new products, and then they would send them out and they would sell them. So it was a very, very profitable enterprise for everybody involved. The we don't, I the reason why these workshops are important, they call them workshops. Basically, what they were factories. Is it was for the first time, basically in human history, you got people together and you got them to work in one place that wasn't near where they lived, right? People would move to come work in these factories, and usually these workshops or these factories would be somewhere close to water for power until the steam engine, but you still kind of need water for the steam engine. And when you get things like the spinning mule and the spinning jenny and all of these innovations, and you get all of these people together and under one roof trying to create the same thing, we kind of call them sweatshops today, and that's what they were back then. Don't get me wrong. I mean, factory life was really, really difficult. But when you get all these people together and doing one thing, they could produce 200 to 300 times more than anything, 200 to 300 times more than anything the world had seen before this time. Okay, so they're becoming extremely, extremely efficient. All right, and what this is also doing is this is create, like, the ma and pa stores are in the rural areas are beginning to disappear. Okay, because these workshops and these sweatshops are starting to take over. These workshops kind of turn into factories when they get so big that there's nowhere else. They have to keep building, but there's nowhere else to build. So what ends up happening is these workshops turn into factories, which is basically just a very big workshop. Here's some numbers for you. Cotton, for instance, in 1760 they imported 2.5 million pounds in Britain to create, things from cotton, clothes mostly, and then rugs, and then send it out. And by 1837 they were importing 366 million pounds. Okay, so that's an astronomical in basically one generation, maybe two generations. They're importing almost 200 times as much. The price falls of cotton because it gets overrun the market, but it doesn't matter because profits are expanding so dramatically. They're still making so much money just due to the sheer volume of selling all of their cotton around the world that it doesn't really matter. Some of the debates, and we'll talk a little more about the debates, but some of the debates that came out usually around 1830 or so. And most of it is about working conditions, right? There was no 8-hour day law, so a lot of people were working 3 a.m. jobs to 10 p.m. days. Some people were working 19, 20 hours a day, and it was a lot of small children and women, and they were roughly 2/3 of the working class at the time in Britain in the 1830s. And the reason why women and children were used, it's fairly simple. Women and children have small hands, all right, and they have dainty hands, and they're more I'm looking for the word, but they can do things easier with the small hands through weavers and things. So that's the main reason why women and children were used. But the secondary reason women with children are used is because they're easier to control, right? Not that sounded bad. Not in a sense, but kind of in the sense that you're thinking about, right? You can tell a child what to do, and he or she has to listen to you, right? Not so much a woman, but men at that time believed, and men always ran the shops. Men believed that it was easier to control 100 women and tell them what to do, rather than trying to get 100 men and tell them what to do. So there was a lot of people who were of that opinion as well. So that's roughly why women and children were 2/3 of the workforce in Britain in factories by the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. So that's why some of the debates come up. Real quickly, other advancements, and we'll go through these quickly. Coal, iron, and steel. The whole catalyst for all of these innovations is coal, iron, and steel. The first one is pig iron. Pig iron was a little. You have to remember, everything before this time was built with wood. Okay. And so pig iron was something that. Pig iron is kind of in between wood and steel. It's not quite. Iron is not quite steel. Right? Steel is the toughest, but it's oxidized more. But iron is a little more bendable. It's not quite as structurally sound. But there's a lot of things you can do with iron that you can't do with steel. But anyway, so they started building things out of iron and steel instead of wood. Machines, engines, railroads, very important. Ag implements, also very important, and hardware. And then the British are very good at this, and they start exporting it around the globe. Also in Britain, the steam engine comes into play. Thomas Newcomb was the first, but these were huge, and they were only good for mining. And it was really James Watt in 1763, who made a steam engine for everything. It was all very inefficient and expensive, and it was slow, but what all of these things put together do is create railroads. Okay, and railroads are extremely important, not only to the creation of the Industrial Revolution, but also America. I don't know if any of you watched the show Hell on Wheels. If you're interested in how America kind of got transformed in the movement west, definitely watch that show. Great show. But anyways, here are some numbers about railroads. The first one was built in England in 1825, and it was from the city of Durham to the coal fields. Okay, so it was built specifically to move coal from the mine to the town, which is basically how most coal gets around the United States today, is by train. And it moved at 15 miles per hour, which was astronomical, right? Nothing in the history of the world could move at 15 miles per hour for that long and for that many miles until the steam engine was invented. Like we talked about, the fastest way that you moved for thousands and thousands of years was by caravan, and usually by horses. But you can't travel 15 miles per hour a day, all day, every day with horses. All right. And then you had investment, so people invested in it. It was risky, but it was highly profitable. So in 5 years after the Durham coal mine train, the first passenger train was created, and it was from Liverpool to Manchester. And you guys have probably heard of those cities. And this was basically to move people from work to work. There was probably, by 1830, there was no more than a few dozen miles of railroad on the earth. But in 20 years, there was over 23,000 miles. Okay, so this was a huge undertaking. And the people who built these were called the navies. These were Britain. These were rough men, and they had encampments with women and booze, and very, very hell on wheels. If you guys are interested in American, it's the same thing. These people migrated from the countryside because they had no jobs and no work, and then they came and they started building railroad. It was tremendous work because most of the rail is still made without machines. The actual steel and things of the rail are made with machines, but not the actual laying down of the rail. So the London to Birmingham line that was created in the 1850s was the equivalent of making the Great Pyramids, which took 200,000 slaves and 20 years to make. And this was done with less than 5,000 men in a little over 4 years. Okay, so that's just an example of how the Industrial Revolution and machinery and efficiency can move dirt and build things that took thousands of people and years to make, and they do it in a little under 4 years. Here's just a picture of the British Empire, and there's the old saying, the sun never set on the British Empire, because it did not. So you can see from Australia to India to Africa to South America to Canada. So the sun actually did not set on the British Empire. Okay, so we'll touch upon the continent real quickly. The continent meaning Europe, that is not Britain, continental Europe. It's much larger than Britain, obviously, and it has more coal deposits, but the problem with the continent, France, Spain, Germany, even into Russia was way behind by this time, is that the cities were farther away from each other. Rivers were less navigable. There wasn't as much private and political governmental investment. And really, they were still going through the throes of feudalism, the ending of it. You know, you had serfdom, you had peasants, and with that you have less innovation. And bottom line is the wars that were going on, and we'll talk about the wars, but right in the late 1700s, you have the French Revolution, which was disastrous. At the same time, the French are fighting the Austrians and the Germans, and then after the French Revolution, you get Napoleon, who was a very capable and smart man, but he fought a lot. So the wars continental Europe didn't really get on track until 1820, the early 1820s. And that's when wars kind of ended, and then you started getting a population growth, and then you get a balance of power that helps with stability. Because, like we talked about, the bottom line is you need stability to nurture economic growth. And also at this time, governments started helping out, much like they did in Britain. Britain was a preeminent power as far as the Industrial Revolution goes until about the mid-19th century. And after that, in the next 20 years, France, Germany, Belgium, and even the U.S., very much the U.S., kind of emerged as these challengers, as iron and steel are growing exponentially, right? People are starting to learn how to make it just like the British do. Railways and restrictions on moving goods lessened throughout the world, especially in Europe. And limited law liabilities begin as well, which are patents, things like that. Anything that is good for economic and business growth, Europe kind of starts to figure out as well. They kind of realize that you need government and free trade in a sense to get things really moving in the right direction. Kind of what Adam Smith was talking about, right? You need this invisible hand. If people can do and buy things that they want to, then that will be to the betterment of society as a whole. And at this time, real quickly, we'll just go, there's two phases kind of the Industrial Revolution, especially on the continent. And the first one is relatively small in scope, and it deals with the production of cheaper and better clothes, metals, and faster travel. Okay, kind of what we talked about with Britain. But the second phase of the Industrial Revolution gets into bigger things, and Great Britain is no longer advantageous, have an advantageous position here. You get things like transatlantic cable and telephone and communications, right? New chemical processes, dyes, pharmaceuticals, energy, medicine, all of these things start to be becoming mass produced, right? And most importantly, you get energy. And the energy we're talking about is electricity in Germany and the US, okay? You get electricity, and probably most important to our world today is you get oil and the refining of oil. in the late 1800s. So things are starting to really, really come to a head and get mass produced at the end of the 1800s. Not just clothes and textiles and coal anymore, but all kinds of goods and all kinds of natural resources. What all of this does is it basically starts the absolute domination of the world by Western Europe. Okay, and we talked about the colonialism and all of that, and all of that comes through because they were industrially far more efficient and sufficient than anybody else in the world, and this helps them basically take over the world by the 1900s. So that's the bottom line. Is West Europe was advanced financially, economically, culturally, and industrially, and politically more advanced in a lot of senses than anybody else in the world, and they took advantage of that, which we've kind of already talked about. And don't worry about the East India companies, because we've already talked about them quite a bit. That's how these things start to get built, is because this idea of globalization and making the world smaller and going out and finding new things, and the government is helping do this. Okay, so as Europe is industrializing and people start moving into the cities, which we call urbanization, I'm sure you guys have all heard that term, consequences come out of this. You have to remember at this time there was little to no social planning, right? There weren't civil engineers, there weren't city engineers. People were just moving into cities and just living wherever they could. Unfortunately, I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but if you look at pictures of a lot of larger cities in South America, and these favelas is what they're called, and in Africa too. Unfortunately, you see what this is. People just have no job or no way of sustenance out in the rural areas, so they move into towns and they start living in shacks, essentially. This is something that happened in Europe in the 1800s as well. There's no planning, there's no sewage, there's not of anything. At the same time, the population was just massively growing. Most of this probably, they think, had to do with agricultural ways to be more efficient. The more food you grow, obviously, the more people can eat, so people were starting to get more food in their diet, more calories. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's life was better. That was not the case at all. But at the same time, in 1800, the world population was probably around 200 million. In Britain. In 1800, the population was probably Europe, 200 million. By 1914, on the eve of World War I, it was 480 million. In 1800, the world population was 900 million. And by 1914, it was 1.6 billion. I think that it only took the world 12 years to move its last billion, I think, right? From 5 to 6 billion, it only took 12 years, which is actually kind of scary when you think about it, considering the thousands and thousands of years it took to get to 5 billion, and then it only took 12 to get to 6. But a lot of this did not have to do with the idea that life expectancy was higher, because it really wasn't. And hygiene really wasn't a key to this as well, because the life expectancy in Berlin, for instance, was still only 30 years old in 1880. In Liverpool and Manchester, if you lived in town and worked in a factory, your average life expectancy was 18 years old at the end of the 19th century. Okay, so this population growth is not because people are living longer, right? Most of us would already be dead if we grew up in Liverpool or Manchester 150 years ago, okay, because we'd have worked in factories and died probably of tuberculosis or dysentery or cholera or something, right? Drinking unclean water. So it wasn't that. It's just people. It's probably more the food and just the idea that more food equals more people. Especially for the peasantry, life still wasn't that good. Use Ireland for example. Usually for the family, you'd have roughly 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day for the whole family. We're talking for 4 or 5 people who are working hard all day. That's not enough calories. I think the average American, I don't know if this is true or not, but I saw the average American eats 3,500 calories a day today. Okay, so think of that. The average American eats as many calories as a five-person family did in Ireland 150 years ago. Okay, so many of them just left, came to the New World. Is more for more nutrition, for less money, and for little land. Okay. The only place that was not hit real hard was the rural areas of Britain, so to speak, because a lot of, like we talked about earlier, a lot of the people who didn't have any land or lost land when they enclosed it moved to the cities. So Britain the rural areas in Britain kind of remained efficient, and people had already started leaving the rural areas in Britain well before the mid-19th century. And what this did is it created this urbanization. Basically, urbanization is when cities get bigger, but in this instance, a lot of instances, it's just cities that are springing up from nowhere. Okay, in 100 years, from 1715 to 1850, London grew from 676,000 people to 2.3 million, and in 100 years, you're almost tripling your population, and with that comes social problems. It becomes unhealthy, overcrowded, construction lags far behind growth, and you get poor people living in basements or attics without any light or drainage or water or decent food, and what all of this does is it just breeds disease. Okay, and these are the things that Dickens, I don't know if you've heard of them, Hugo, Balzac, those are French guys, Disraeli, he's another British guy. That's what all of these people are writing about. George Eliot, things like this, just how these towns, Dickens calls them coke towns, right? He calls them coke towns because the walls are black on the buildings because of the air pollution. The rivers are purple from inks and dyes that are created to make all of these mass-produced shirts, right? It's just not a healthy environment, and people are living close together. And that's one other reason why they argued, because of the population growth, is when you get people living close together with no contraception, they tend to have sex, and then they tend to have kids. All right, so that's another reason why. And that's another reason why they think that a lot of the population growths really in the 1800s Britain, it was probably what people considered to be the most intense air pollution in the history of the world, in the sense that there were no government controls or door controls at all, right? You could do whatever you wanted to with your factory, and it showed. It was a very unhealthy place to live. 25% of British deaths in all of the United Kingdom were from bronchitis and tuberculosis, which basically comes from inhaling dirty air. The rivers became toxic with not only human waste but also industrial waste. London and Paris had sewage systems, but these sewage systems emptied into the Thames and the Seine, which is the two major rivers of the country. So they did have sewage, but it just moved it to the rivers, which moved it into the oceans. So you get cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, and the Rhine River was just as bad in Germany. And in a lot of areas, it wasn't really until after World War II that a lot of these rivers actually get cleaned up. And with all of this social degradation came the social question, right? And the social question came out of the French Revolution, but it also kind of came out of the Industrial Revolution as well. It's the social question is and it especially came from politicians and people who were trying to make life better for everybody. And the questions were, what are we going to do with all of this crime? You know, people get together and they get scared and they get poor, and then they resort to crime, right? What are we going to do with this crime? There's no good drinking water. There's sewage everywhere. There's prostitution. There's tuberculosis, cholera, alcoholism, unemployment. People aren't getting paid enough, and all of these things kind of come under the guise of the social question. So, in a sense, you start to get reforms. You know, police, kids, they're trying to hand out inoculations. You get a little better sewage systems, schools, and laws, and factory acts, and city planning. But in reality, conditions did not change that much in the city, and it was still terrible for many until, you know, World War I, World War II, and the post-World Wars. All right. So first, we're going to talk about the middle class, and then we'll talk about the working class. And this kind of deals with Britain, but in a sense, it also deals with French and German, and in some small way, Danish, Spanish, middle class as well. And this is a picture by a pre-Raphaelite called Venus, and it's by Gabriel Rossetti. This woman here, I can't remember her name, but they like to paint her a lot, and you usually didn't see that many redheaded women painted before this time, and especially in place of Venus, right, who's the goddess of love and beauty. And Rossetti's idea was, well, beauty is subjective. Just because this woman has red hair does not mean that she is not a Venus, which she was to actually quite a few of them. But anyways, kind of what we talked about before is this whole genre of writing comes out called realism, and it's exactly what the definition means. It is these guys like Dickens, Balzac, Victor Hugo, if you've heard of him, wrote Les Mis, Hunchback of Notre Dame. Balzac wrote this thing called the Germinal. No, I'm sorry, I apologize. That is Zola, who writes the Germinal, which is basically it. And I think it's 1920 books based in Paris about this one family, generations of family of working class, middle class people. And what these guys are doing is they're just, these plots, they're just showing what everyday life is for these people. I mean, it's tragic. They're poor, their children die, they get sick, they have to become prostitutes, they have all of these children that they don't want because they can't get contraception. You know, it's just like this long list over and over and over again of people who just, bad things happen to them because society doesn't care about them, and because of this new urbanization and urbanization. And they also start writing about these plots that it's not about hierarchy of rank and status and privilege so much anymore, but about wealth and social class, right? These guys aren't Marxists in the sense that, and we'll talk about Marx next week about class. They aren't class driven, so to speak, but they are saying that it's not about being an aristocrat and not being one now. It's about whether you have money or you don't have money. Okay? Money trumped all. And so that's what these guys are writing about, and they're saying if you don't have money, then your life is awful, and then they write about it. Okay. And what kind of comes out of this is this idea of the middle class, right? Today, I think they said 90% of Americans think they're middle class, right? Middle class is what you aspire to. I mean, well, everybody wants to be upper class, but everybody knows that they're not upper class. So, as opposed to being working class, you would rather be middle class. And they definitely delineate themselves from other people in Britain and in other places of Europe at this time. And basically what the upper class people were, they were lawyers. There's classifications even in middle class, right? And you have people at the top who are lawyers, doctors, professionals. But then the factory owners. But then at the same time at the lower end you had clerks, officials, white-collar workers, things like that. People who weren't lower class. They were just middle-class people who worked every day. In this time, the idea that movement was possible, but you had to have an education, and you had to pass tests to do this, right? You get like CPA exams, doctor's exams, doctor school, things like medical school, things like that, okay? But what comes with it is this whole idea that you can move upward with hard work and intelligence, okay? This is an idea that comes out of the Industrial and the French Revolution. We kind of take it for granted today, but before that, especially in Western civilization, well, I think just the world in general, it was very hard to move up through hard work and intelligence. You needed money, or you were just born the way you were, and you couldn't move up, period. No matter how hard you worked, no matter how intelligent you were. And so, this is a newish idea in the history of in human history. Some of the values, or general values of the middle class, is the idea that we're not poor, but we're not rich. We're not the aristocracy. Okay, we've done things by ourselves, and we deserve power. And when I'm talking about power, I'm talking about power in the government, right? They believe that money and hard work means power. And when we talk about power, we're talking about power in the government, power to vote or power to be elected. They also valued financial independence. You were responsible for your own family. Men, this is generally speaking, tried to avoid gambling and debt. You know, you try to have some character. Live modestly, sober, avoid consumption, don't dress lavishly, don't go out and get a lot of prostitutes, and other forms of behavior that we'll talk about. They equate with being an aristocrat or a working class person, right? Poor people and rich people use prostitutes, not middle class people. Okay, that's the idea and the values. That's what aristocrats who don't work hard and have money and have nothing else to do, they're the ones who go see prostitutes, not us. Now, this is generally speaking, and we'll see that this doesn't necessarily happen, but this is the value that a lot of these people are trying to uphold. Private life, the family was very crucial, and really the best way to ensure this was through marriage, right? We've all heard about it. You know, people marrying for, especially males, you know, they would marry their boss's daughter, you know, things like that. We've all heard of that. And families were intensely practical, right? Sons, nephews, cousins assume responsibilities of the older males when it's their turn. Wives would be at home, but they would manage the accounts. In-laws were there for credit, connections, inheritance, etc. If your family was well run, they thought, then so would your life be, right? If your private life is well run, your public life will be well run. There were separate spheres for men and women. Wives were supposed to boys were supposed to go to school and get educated. Girls were supposed to stay at home and read manuals and poetry and journals it's kind of this, even though middle class women are starting to read, a lot of them kind of still stayed in this classical idea of what we think of as a male-dominated relationship. But at the same time, women kind of start becoming companions and helpmates, as opposed to, somebody who you can tell what to do, right? You need them, and they're the ones who are running the house. They're the ones who are spending the money and buying the groceries and getting the kids off and doing everything that the male does not do. And you have to also understand that they're trying to separate themselves from the upper class and the lower classes, right? And we'll talk about the working class. Women in the working class had to work. So if you were middle class, and which everybody aspired to, then you didn't want your wife to work. And if, as a wife, you didn't want to work, because then that meant you weren't wealthy enough to not work. Okay, so it was definitely all about social status. So I don't want you to get the impression that all of these women wanted to go out and become and be these businesswomen, because they didn't, because that's what working class people did. Okay. So the wife really had to make sure everything was going right, and there was a very large economical value to that. So they were very important. But at the same time, a lot of these, marriages were passionless, very Victorian in the sense of the word, kind of synonymous with anxiety, prudishness, ignorance, etc. One English writer was told on a wedding just to lie back and think of the empire, right? She obviously wasn't getting married for love. There's also this kind of scientific idea to it. Women could not get higher education because their brains were smaller and fragile. I'll give you an example. One guy wrote 15 to 20 out of 28 days, women is not only invalid, but a wounded one. I think you know what he's talking about. She ceaselessly suffers from love's eternal wounds, right? So there's that idea. I mean, I'm just telling you that because it's funny how, even though women are starting to have a larger role in society, there's still, all of these ideas running around, which just makes me laugh. But anyways, at the same time, even if marriage was passionless, I mean, you still slept with your significant other, but you have to remember at this time there was not, late 1700s, mid 1800s, into the 1900s, there was no real good contraception. So how did you stop having kids? It was rough on the body, and it takes money. 1 in 100 births ended in death of the woman anyways. So I think if you're pregnant 8 or 9 times in your life, then that's not good. So pregnancy is scary for women, and it's scary for men as well. So men and women tried to find ways of contraception. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but it was hard. It was really hard to keep from getting pregnant at this time. So here's a painting by Ford Madox Brown, which is actually entitled Work, which is a very good painting of the Industrial Revolution in Britain at the time, because it encompasses everything, right? I mean, you have pictures of a navy who's building roads. This is actually on Heath Street, which is still a pretty famous one to the street today. You have disruption of society because there's a hole in the road, right? So what he's saying is this hole in the road is creating a hole in the social fabric, right? So all classes are shown. You have the people on the horse, the aristocrats in the back. You have the working class women with too many children and their dog, and you can get the picture. I don't need to go through it, but just take a look at all of the people who are involved in this. You have the drunk in the middle. He's saying, look what is happening to society, because we have this hodgepodge of people in it, and you get a hole in the road, you get a hole in the fabric of society. Alright, so lastly we're going to talk about the working class, and then I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite paintings in history that's on the next page. It's really cool. It's quite large as well. But this painting on the right is called Waiting for Verdict, and it's by Abraham Solomon. And it's a very good depiction of the working class, because here's, this guy who definitely does not have a lot of money, and he just got out of the court, and he knows that he's going to lose. And what Solomon was trying to say is the reason why he knows he's going to lose is because he couldn't afford a lawyer because he's poor, and because what's happening is society is starting just to round poor people up and just start putting them in jail, right? And then so that's kind of the idea, right? You have a woman smiling there. You also have a woman who's stern looking, but that's his idea. Just like the middle class, the working class had their own subgroups, just depending on skill, gender, and wages. Conditions were different on where you lived. For instance, you could be a skilled textile worker, which was working class, or you could be the guy who digs ditches, right, or cleans trash. There's a definite difference between the two. So there is also subgroups that way. Education was usually a luxury, and the reason for this is fairly simple, because you could send your kids to work, right? Even your male kids. And actually downward mobility was a real cause for concern with new technology. So where the middle class are looking to move up, a lot of the working class were just hoping that they didn't keep moving down in society. Okay, so there's a difference there. Like the middle class, the women were supposed to run the household, but they were also supposed to work, and they worked harder and they worked for less money. Okay, so the life of a working class woman was very, very difficult. Okay, and that's what especially Zoloft writes about. Right. Emil Zoloft, you're not sitting reading any of his books. He writes a lot about working class women and how hard it was. And a lot of them do have to turn to prostitution and other things to make money that's needed. And then obviously if you're prostitution, that means you're having sex. That means you probably are going to have more illegitimate children than you already have, right? And so it's kind of this cycle. At the same time, they didn't have gardens, so you had to go to the city market for cheap food, but a lot of this food was rotten, dangerous, or stale. For instance, people would use formaldehyde in milk to keep it from spoiling. You'd put rice into sugar to sell more, to sell more bunk. You'd put dirt in the chocolate, things like that. So it wasn't the greatest life in the world. At the same time, women didn't have too many options. Like we talked about, they could work in the sweatshops, which is mainly where they did because they were more docile and they had smaller hands to run the looms. And this whole idea of sweatshops is one of the main reasons by the end of the 19th century governments are really starting to make changes. Also, there was this thing called the promiscuous blending of sexes in the workplace, right? So you had unguarded children, small children dying in mills, pregnant women hauling coal or trying to keep up with men physically. So, excuse me, so there's all of these ideas of women working and children working way too hard. But for the most part, most worked in factories and sweatshops, where you get low wage paid, not by the hour, but what you produced. And they were humid, and they were hot, and they were disgusting. So that is some of the options. There were other options for women. If you were unmarried and you got lucky, you could be a servant, and that would obviously be low paying. And a lot of times that would mean sexual dominance by the males of the household, whether they would be fathers or sons, right? But I guess some women would prefer that to prostitution or working in a sweatshop. So basically what would happen for a woman if she moved from the town into the city is when you got to the city, you tried to get married. But if you didn't, then you would rent a room at a boarding house, which boarding houses kind of became synonymous with prostitution. Centers of prostitution. Um, you would do domestic service, or you would try to find somebody to live with. So those were basically the options that women had at the time. And with all of these options comes just this whole idea of sexuality, in the sense that poverty and the absence of privacy and vulnerability, it makes sexuality different from the working class than the middle class and the upper class, right? Illegitimacy rose exponentially. No longer were these people waiting to have marriage to have sex, or if they got pregnant, they weren't marrying the people who impregnated them because they didn't live with their families anymore. They weren't forced to do it. Right? They lived on their own. And so usually what tended to happen, this is a very generalization, is that a woman would get pregnant and then, the male would leave because he didn't want to have to deal with that. And there was very little contraceptions. Abortions were very, very dangerous and very expensive, right, at this time. So illegitimacy rose. Some as much as a third of all births in some areas were illegitimate kids. It's hard to establish why. Some say you're moving to a city and you're getting out of your family life, so you have this freedom to do what you want to. Getting pregnant didn't mean you had to marry people. You had anonymity. You didn't have to pay dowries, etc., etc. But the bottom line is you have a lot of people living close together with, not a lot to do. There's not a lot of shame involved in all of this, so people are having sex and having children. At the same time, we talked about prostitution flourishes, so much so that in the 1850s there was tons of articles about it, newspapers writing about the hierarchy of the trade, right? So at the top you had what were called entrepreneurs, and these were the men, or women sometimes, who were in the boarding houses. You had fancy men who were what we would call pimps today. These were the guys who would manage the street, right? Who would do things for the entrepreneurs. They would be the ones who had the most direct contact with the prostitutes and the johns. And then you had a few prima donnas who were courtesans, prima donnas were women who enjoyed the protection of rich middle class or upper class men. Right, so these were, I don't know if there's such a word, perhaps you could say lucky prostitutes, high-end prostitutes, right? And usually they could entertain as well, right? They weren't just prostitutes, they were companions, so to speak. But the vast majority of prostitutes, whether you were a woman or a man, were long hours. They were dangerous. They were in ports or lodging houses where men who wanted prostitutes were, and it was a dangerous life. And you didn't live that long. It was disease-ridden and all of these other things. So all of these things are going to lead to prostitution. At the same time, because crime was so rampant in a lot of these poverty-stricken areas, and prostitution was so high, and corruption and disease, the working class kind of became known as the dangerous class. So, so people start writing about their licentiousness and their moral weakness, saying it's their fault they're in this, it's not our fault. While a lot of other people were saying, well, that's not necessarily true, it's not a choice, it's just the system needs to be reformed. We need to help these people. But the bottom line is that, especially the role of women in the two classes, were not that different. The only difference is that working class women had to work to earn pay, whereas the middle class women kind of ran the household. And a lot of working class women obviously turned to prostitution. I don't know how many, and I don't know how many middle class women turned to prostitution, but there was also that. There's also, since this is the whole idea that we're talking about, just this whole idea of a class consciousness. Really, for the first time, it's black and white, right? You're either working class, or you're middle class, or you're the aristocracy. It's glaringly obvious which one you are. And we'll talk a lot more about this, but a lot of people lose pride in their work, which really prevents them from organizing, and they become vulnerable to employees, and that's the whole thing that Marx and Engels talked about. Factory hours are 12 and 14 hours. Mills weren't ventilated. You had lint in your lungs. Kids were working in mines. People's bodies were changing because they were just working their whole lives. Bent over. Males literally were only living to 18 to 19 years old. And this is also the time that the clock comes into play. It used to be that human beings worked on their own schedule, right? When you could get things done, you got things done. But now you actually had to check in. Think about the clock. We're used to clocks. People weren't used to clocks for most of the history of civilization. This is a new idea of using the clock to measure work, okay, and to measure anything, to measure education, time, right? And this whole idea of the machine becoming a tyrant that changed your life and it bound you to your owner, to your slave driver, right? If you worked in a factory, the clock and the machine were your worst enemy, right? And just the working class had this whole idea of vulnerability, right? If you miss work for a week, it's probably a lot like today with federal employees, right? I think a lot of Americans can miss one paycheck, but 2 or 3 is going to be tough, right? That's the feeling of vulnerability, and that's what the working class went through, right? Death, sickness, accidents, crisis, raises in food, seasonal employment. All of this thing is overwhelming feeling that nobody's going to help me if any of those things happen, which is true, okay? So, this is kind of the scenario that you have, which we'll talk about next week, and this is why the working class people and how they live their lives is a big reason that Karl Marx writes and thinks the way that he does. Okay, so this is one of my favorite paintings, and if you ever have a class with Dr. Sean Quinlan about 19th, 20th century thought, any of those ideas, he will also talk about this. And it's called Olympia, and it's by Edouard Manet with an A, not an O, although he lived at the same time as Edward Monet, but this is Manet. And this painting is not in the Louvre, it's actually in the Musée d'Orsay, Dorsay. So if any of you ever get the chance, after you listen to this and you're in Paris, then you can go to the museum and see this painting, and it's really rather quite large. I'm guessing it's probably, 4.5, 5 feet high, and probably 7 to 8 feet across. So when you see it, it's very large. It is not a small painting. Okay, and we can't flip back and forth, but it's a copy or it's a take on Titian's idea of Venus. Okay, and that's the painting that's in your next slide. But this one is a little different, and this was shocking. When this came out, people just did not know what to do with themselves. Because the whole idea of this painting that Manet is saying is, well, you can see what she is, right? I mean, this is a prostitute. He's saying Venus is a prostitute, right? which just shocked people at first, but then there's so much more to this than that. There's obviously the black cat that you can see. There's the black servant instead of perhaps maybe a white servant, which people just could not believe at the time. It's hard to tell from this painting, or unless you're really looking at it in person. The reason why you can tell she's a prostitute is because she's not exactly healthy looking. You can't really tell from this painting that she's kind of white and she's blotchy, which probably means she has some type of venereal disease. Okay. And she's naked, which the nakedness actually didn't really cause anybody too much alarm because, Europeans are used to painting of naked women. I mean, the nakedness is not the issue. The issue is she's kind of white, she's kind of pasty. She probably has something wrong with her as far as disease goes. She may have syphilis, what have you. But the two things that really made people sit back and say, whoa, I'm offended by this, is that she's looking right at her eyes are centered right at the people who are looking at this painting. And who are the people who are looking at this painting? It's middle class and rich men. Okay? So she's looking at these people and she's saying, I know who you are because you're the person who sent me these flowers. Okay? So that's why everybody was in an uproar about it, because she's saying, you cheat on your wife, you say you're a good person, you say you're living these middle class morals, you say you're not seeing prostitutes, you say you're living a life of morality and compassion, and she says, but I saw you last night, and now you're sending me flowers. Okay? So that is the main reason why everybody was so up in arms about this, is because it's very much a social commentary on life and on the hypocrisy, especially of the middle class, right? In European society, if you were upper class, you saw prostitutes. That's just what you did, and nobody really looked down upon it in that sense, right? You probably married some woman for her money. You didn't love her at all. Your family may have even arranged it, and so you go and you cheat on her. And that's just the way it is. Loveless marriage, right? But what Olympia's saying is, these middle class men is, you have a different type of lifestyle, and you're still coming to see me. And if you look at the other painting of Venus by Titian, their hands are kind of the same, especially her left hand. But the other thing that made people real upset is that she's kind of holding her vulva, which basically she's saying, yeah, you liked it, and I'm in control of you, right? She's saying, I have all the power over you. I'm looking at you. You're the one who sent me flowers. You need me. I don't need you, kind of idea. And there's a lot of other things to this, but that's the main idea. Don't want to talk about it too much, but that's Olympia by Edouard Manet. And then you can look at the next painting by Titian and kind of see the differences and the similarities. And that's the other reason why people were upset. Right? I mean, he's ripping off a very, very famous painting, and he's kind of creating, I wouldn't say blasphemy, but, sacrilegious type of idea, right? So that's Olympia by Manet, M-A-N-E-T.